A major criminal investigation is underway tonight after dozens of hungry migrants were discovered crowded inside a squalid 3-bedroom home in South Auckland.
Jatinder Patel's been here before. Ram raiders targeting his business last month.
Deportation of a New Zealand-born teenager has been put on hold, and the Associate Immigration Minister now has to decide whether he's allowed to stay for good.
This is what we're used to hearing about the Indian community in New Zealand.
I'd blame the media for highlighting these issues. Even though we need those issues, they tend to forget that there are other positive things that's happening in the community.
But there's more to our third largest ethnic group than stories of struggle and exploitation and an annual festival.
24 Diwali, like every other year, it just gets better and bigger, and of course a lot more for our communities to come and have a look and enjoy today.
Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, the untold stories of Aotearoa's Indian community as one city celebrates a centenary of settlement.
So Indians are not just people who are getting exploited all the time, or we've been here for more than a century.
Those 100+ years do include stories of exploitation, struggle and hardship, but also tales of bravery, determination and success. RNZ Asia journalist Blessin Tom says we shouldn't let the negative stories be the only thing that defines public perceptions of the Indian community.
Indian farmers have been in the dairy industry for a very long time. They are huge contributors to New Zealand's economy. There are big businesses that are being run by Indians and Indian associations celebrating more than 100 years. So they have been here. They all started with collecting bottles in the early 1900s. They've done hawking, and then they've moved to veggies and fruits and to dairy, and that's still happening. So I feel really sad when the media only portrays those kind of stories. But I think we should definitely have another look into the communities. We should highlight their achievements. But also, we need to discuss their problems.
Indians have played an important role in growing Aotearoa's business, trade and economy. Take the dairy industry, an example Blessin just mentioned. Many of the farms in the Waikato, the country's dairy powerhouse, were started by Indian settlers in the early 1900s. A lot of the farms are still run by later generations of the same families. A lot has changed since the early days of Indian migration, but one thing that remains the same is their reason for coming here.
This pathway of living in India and wanted a better life, and then coming to a country like New Zealand, and then you sort of start working, and then you think about a business idea, and then you eventually own a business. That's the case with the migrants in the early 19th century, and that still is the case with the current generation.
The history of New Zealand's Indian community isn't a topic many will be very familiar with, unless you're Jackie Leckie. She's spent most of her career researching and writing about the history of Indian migration. Her latest book is written for the centenary of the Wellington Indian Association, which is being celebrated today. It goes through the history of our capital city's Indian population, how they came here, settled and developed into the community that's there today.
So looking more at the sort of importance of place and connection, which you would find in other parts of Aotearoa.
You won't come across many, if any, stories about Indians in New Zealand history books. So it may come as a surprise that Indians were already here as far back as the late 1700s.
These were Indian people that were on ships. They were known as Lascars. I think it was about 1769. There's records of some Indian sailors on ships. One was with the French East India Company, and then later Indian men were working on ships that were run by the British East India Companies. So those are the very earliest traces. We know that some of these Indian men that were on ships, a few of them absconded, or what's called jumping ship, and some of them would have married or had relationships with Maori women. That's from about the early 19th century.
Are there any generational connections still around in New Zealand today that link back to those first Indian migrants?
No, we're not aware of any. The sailors would have had pretty itinerant lives, and most of them did stay on the ships. So they may have got off the ship when they were working and collecting seal skins or something like that, but there's no connection there. The earliest connection probably is from the late 1850s, very different sort of group, but these were servants, indentured servants that came out to work on the Kashmir estate, actually in Christchurch. They were working for a former judge, John Cracroft Wilson. So there will be descendants of some of those people, but there's been so much intermarriage with that particular family that, they're very tenuous links. Then in the 19th century, we start to get some traders that were known as hawkers coming to Aotearoa. We have a man from India who was actually the person who discovered gold.
The first person to find gold at this gully was a shepherd called Edward Peters. He's thought to have been from Mumbai and might have dug for gold in California before coming to Aotearoa. Gabriel Reid followed up on Peter's discovery and was the first to promote the field more widely.
But the Indian people who settled in our country, that didn't really start to happen until probably the late 19th century.
Most of the early Indian migrants were men. The first came mainly from Punjab, an area in the northwest of India, which in those days included parts of what we now know as Pakistan. People from Gujarat on the west coast of India began migrating later, heading not only to New Zealand but to parts of Australia, the Pacific Islands and South Africa. Their main motivation was money.
Looking for better opportunities, trying to make more money. But they were facing a lot of rural upheaval in India at that time. So there was pressure on families and villages in some areas to try and look for, new opportunities or ways to sort of, make more money. The other interesting thing is that in some of these villages, there were not the same taboos on travel overseas that you might find in some other parts of India. So I guess we can look at it as a combination of factors that were motivating or pushing people to look for new opportunities. There was a lot of environmental degradation in some of these areas, so shortages of land. But we can also look at it in terms of the opening up of the empire and the sort of networks and opportunities, shipping routes that were opening up as well. And of course, once word got back that there was work or opportunities in certain countries, then close members of the family would often join them.
In the early days, New Zealand's Indian population was pretty small, but it was enough to ruffle more than a few feathers. People in Wellington, including politicians, voiced their fear of a, quote, Oriental invasion of not just Indians, but other Eastern migrants as well. That fear was also evident in other white settler colonies these migrants were entering.
Wellington was a growing city at that time, and there would have been people coming from very different backgrounds. So there was perhaps some acceptance, but I think very much the issue of colour and race was at the forefront of a lot of people's perceptions. So even though they quietly sort of, were okay about Indian people being in Wellington, we soon get, especially during the early 20th century, just after World War I, when times were pretty tough economically, we start to get outcry by white people about the fact that these Indian people were taking over their businesses or competing with them. So that idea of economic competition was very strong, but it was also very much interwoven with what we now can see was racist.
Those views fueled several attempts to exclude Indians from certain jobs and monitor and limit their movement around the city. For example, in the late 1920s, the Wellington City Council tried to get Indian bottle collectors to wear ID straps on their sleeves. It didn't go ahead after the Wellington Indian Association protested against it. They had to wear badges instead.
There were some attempts to exclude Indians from driving taxis, which seems quite ironic given that so many of our taxi drivers in the country today are Indian immigrants. And there was an attempt to exclude Indians from working on buses. There would have been other areas too where Indians were discriminated against that aren't perhaps recorded or we don't know about. But at the same time, there were some very warm and close relationships that developed between Indian people and other members of the public. So it's not all sort of a dark history by any means.
Well, let's turn the conversation a bit more to the lighter side of history. Is there anything through your research for this book that surprised you?
Well, there's some sort of funny, quirky stories. Like in 1950s, I have a photograph in the book of an elephant being descended by these big chains. If you can imagine how you get an elephant off a ship before containers, this is quite amazing. So this elephant descending on the docks of Wellington, she was called Bhavani, and she had been a gift by the women of India to the women of New Zealand. And so she marches through town to Wellington Zoo, and then there's a competition, and I don't know why, but she is renamed. So she's now called Kamala. She became a real icon of not just the Wellington Zoo, but you talk just about to anybody in Wellington of that generation, sort of between the 50s and 80s, and they will talk about Kamala the elephant and the Indian house, the elephant house at the Wellington Zoo.
Most Indians chose jobs that didn't require knowing much English. As Jackie mentioned earlier, many started as hawkers, selling produce from a basket on the street. Others made their money by delivering goods to homes in central Wellington.
Some of them started to buy trucks, and so they expanded their businesses right, up to Porirua, into the hut. So they would go to the markets, get the vegetables, fruit and vegetables, load up their trucks, and then take them out and sell them to the sort of more peripheral areas of Wellington. Once women and children joined the men, they had a very important role in these businesses as well. Women would often prepare the fruit and vegetables, wash the potatoes, make things look more sort of appealing. And the children would often be working in the businesses before and after school. There were a lot of brickyards. They also worked as bottle collectors, what we would call recyclers today. They would collect the bottles and then wash them and then sell them to the bottle merchants. And they worked in factories. Much later, after World War II, Todd Motors was an important factory in Petone that employed Indian workers. And they worked in hotels, in the kitchens. Some of them worked as sort of security guards or what we call doormen. So lots of different sorts of, little opportunities. When women came, one of the first areas where they started to work was in the hospital laundry, and Indian women started to get the first sort of waged work that they had, which gave them quite a bit of independence.
Indian migrants were very driven, and after a bit of time, many would set up new businesses and shops selling mainly fruit and vegetables. This played an important role in Wellington's economic growth.
As Indian people began to accumulate more capital, they began to invest and set up larger businesses. Indian people had a very strong emphasis on education. So by the sort of 1960s, 1970s, we start to see Indian professionals, Indian people working in the civil service, going into teaching. That emphasis on education and emphasis on trying to do better. I think it's as much something that comes from within families. And it's very strong, again, within a lot of migrant families to try and make sure that the following generations have more opportunities. I think also Indian people in Wellington and, some of the other centres in the country, they started to set up sports clubs. So those kinds of things were important in the connections with the wider public. The Indian Association has also been very strong on trying to give back to the community, so they've supported a lot of charities.
And that's the association that's celebrating its 100th birthday today. When it was established, the Indian population was still relatively small, a result of restrictive immigration policies that made it extremely difficult for anyone who wasn't British or Northern European to enter New Zealand. Those policies loosened in the mid-80s.
It opened up to allow people from different parts of India to find it easier to come here, especially if they could invest or come here for education. There's been a huge amount of migration from other parts of India, not just Gujarat and Punjab that I talked about. From 1987, there was large numbers of Indo-Fijians coming to the country because they were being pushed out of Fiji or chose to leave Fiji when Fiji had military coups.
The military persecuted the Indo-Fijian community. More than 70,000 of these people were forced to flee the country.
And it wasn't just Indo-Fijians coming in the late 80s.
There's also been Indian people coming from other branches of the Indian global diaspora, so people coming from South Africa, East Africa, Britain. The sort of movement is very dynamic. There's also people who've come here and left and gone on to other countries like Australia as well.
So what started as a couple of sailors jumping ship grew into a population of close to 300,000, making Indians the third largest ethnic group in the country. And in many ways, it's a group that's thriving. The latest census shows Kiwi Indians earn more than the average New Zealander, have lower unemployment rates and higher rates of academic qualifications. But in other ways, parts of the community are struggling.
A man threatened with deportation despite being born here will now be allowed to stay. 18-year-old Dharman Kumar was born 6 months after an immigration law change and has been an overstayer since the moment he was born.
On its website, Immigration New Zealand has a list of the top 10 nationalities of visa overstayers. India is number 4. So we know that demand's visa problem isn't necessarily unique. But what we don't know is why these individuals choose to stay in New Zealand illegally instead of going back to their home country. Let's bring back Blesson.
People, when they migrate to a country like New Zealand, they migrate here to make their life better. And that's all they want. And when you have children, you want your children to have the New Zealand life. And once they are born in a situation where they don't have a visa or a citizenship, I think the family becomes a bit more afraid. And even though they are trying to get legal, there are other issues that they have to face at the same time, because once you don't have a visa, you won't be able to get a job. So you'd have to work in places where they would agree to pay you under the table. And then that opens the door for exploitation, because most of the overstayers that I've talked to have been exploited because their employers know their situation and they can't just go to the police or find any solutions.
But I think a key issue that's come up is that Daman's parents were considered overstayers from the moment that he was born, and he was considered an overstayer as well. They've known for all of his life that eventually this would happen. So why did they wait until he turned 18?
So Daman's parents were trying to get a visa. They were trying to get residency. But it's really, really hard and it takes a long time. He told me that they went to different lawyers and sometimes lawyers would charge them huge money. And then for that money, they'd have to work under the table. And then from Daman's perspective, when I talked to him, he was saying his childhood was really hard because they would be moving constantly because they're afraid that they'd be caught and being sent back to India.
But why didn't they go back to India?
I asked this question to Daman's parents, and they said that they came to New Zealand to build a life. And to go back was really hard because they didn't have any family back in India to support them. And most of the migrants come to New Zealand after spending huge money. So what they normally do is they'd probably have some land back in India. So they would probably sell it, use that money to get a visa. And it's pretty much the same even if you come to work or to study. So they've invested so much money in this life in New Zealand, and they probably want to stay because they don't want to go back to India where they'll have to start again from zero. And there's a huge shame element when it comes to Indian community. So once you have decided to move to a country like New Zealand or anywhere in the world, they have probably told the family that, okay, we are leaving India. We want to build a better life. And then if they are forced to go back, then they'll have to answer the family and the people and the people in the village. It's a huge Indian thing. And these elements are really, really making these people going back to their country really hard.
So while staying in New Zealand illegally and continue trying to get a visa isn't necessarily easier than going home and starting from scratch, it's the option many choose because they simply don't want to give up on the dream they've already sacrificed so much for. The stories of past and present migrants are complex, a combination of success and struggle. Jackie Leckie says it's important to get the balance right.
I don't treat migrant history as kind of a rags to riches story. I think that's a bit too superficial. So I think it's really important to try and look at some of the nuances. I mean, not everybody is a successful migrant. So I think you need to look at the richness and look more at the complexity. The other stories that need to be told, or the other histories that need to be told, are, I guess, more to do about the relationships and the dynamics within the Indian population in our country, which I think only Indian people can really do that research and tell that story.
That's all for today. Thank you to Jackie Leckie and Blessin Tom. The Detail is a Newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode is engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell. I'm Davina Zimmer, ka kite anō.